Last night, at a precinct in Carlisle, Iowa, a caucus goer spoke in support of Donald Trump. She said, "I know that he is picked by God for this hour. There are things that he has done in his past, but we all have pasts." Things that he has done in his past, but he is picked by God. Now, in addition to statements like that, there is some compelling data to back up how much white Christians, especially evangelicals, love Trump. Entrance polling from last night shows that 55% of the respondents were white evangelical Christians, and 53% of them voted for Trump. Now, compare that to 2016, when 62% of respondents identified as white evangelicals, but only 21% voted for Donald Trump. In the 8 years between those two Iowa caucuses, Donald Trump has not only more than doubled his support from evangelicals, he has also redefined what it means to be one. Author Tim Alberta describes that phenomenon this way. More than any figure in American history, the 45th president transformed evangelical from spiritual signifier into political punchline, exposing the selective morality and ethical inconsistency and rank hypocrisy that had for so long lurked in the subconscious of the movement. To be fair, the slow-motion reputational collapse predated Trump. He did not author the cultural insecurities of this church, but he did identify them and prey upon them in ways that have accelerated the unraveling of institutional Christianity in the United States. Joining me now is Tim Alberta, staff writer at The Atlantic. He is also the author of The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. Tim, I wish I had you at my side last night as we were trying to understand what exactly happened in Iowa, especially with evangelicals. And your writing on this is so essential and so, really to the point that we all want to try and make, which is the way Trump has corrupted the evangelical movement. I wonder, in your estimation, what it means to be an evangelical in this country at this moment.
It's funny, Alex. There's this anecdote where a few decades ago, there was someone who had written in a book that an evangelical was just anybody who liked Billy Graham and followed Billy Graham. And then someone asked Graham about that, and they asked him what he thought it meant to be an evangelical. And he said, that's funny. I'd actually like to know the answer to that myself. And at the risk of being, cute or reductive here, I mean, we are beginning to flirt with this territory where, definitionally speaking, evangelicalism has far more to do, at least in the perception of the greater public, with political engagement, partisan political identification, than it does with any particular theology or any real religious conviction. And if you take it a step further, if you look at the exit polling, if you look at some of the social science around this, if you look at the fact, Alex, that during Donald Trump's presidency, more and more of Donald Trump's supporters were self-identifying as evangelicals, even though they were simultaneously attending church less and less often, I think one might reach the uncomfortable conclusion that perhaps the best definition now for what it means to be an evangelical is to be a conservative, white, Republican Trump supporter. And that is a tragedy on any number of different levels, but I think most profoundly it is a tragedy for the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Well, right. If the gospel is no longer part of the equation, what is it replaced by? And that sort of leads to my next question, which is, do you think MAGAism has become a placeholder for a certain kind of religion?
Well, yes. I mean, if you think about what it means to be religious, if you think about what it means to have an identity rooted in an unshakable faith, again, I don't want to be reductive here, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. Again, the evangelical community is large, it's huge, and it's complicated, and there's a lot of texture here to explore. But what we're seeing time and again, and I mean 53% in Iowa. I mean, this is now we're reaching a place where we're being confronted with some uncomfortable realities about what it means to be a part of the evangelical movement, and frankly, where the line blurs between sort of religious identity and political identity, and is there a merging of the two? And frankly, I think that there's always a danger in politics, whatever side of the political aisle you're on, of sort of turning political conviction into religious conviction, or worshiping at a certain altar that is not an altar to God, but is an altar to political idolatry or to political identity. That is a danger that's always been there, but it is, I think, uniquely dangerous in this moment. And to be clear, as I write about in the book, we have examples from the not-so-distant past of a sort of political religion, or at least a civil religion, supplanting, competing with actual religion. And I don't think that we're all that far removed from that in this country now, looking at just what happened last night in Iowa.
Well, yeah, and it's clear that Trump wants to capitalize on the sort of religious fervor that may undergird some people's support of him. I mean, he's out there taking out ads. The God Made Trump video, where they literally, in the video, called Trump a shepherd to mankind. I mean, he's not shying away from this. You know, I've been to a number of Trump rallies, Tim, as a journalist, and I think the thing that people miss about Trumpism and MAGAism is the sense of belonging that is so fundamental to the entire MAGA movement. The Trump, you know, in addition to being xenophobic, racist events, they are also much like revivals. There's a lot of camaraderie. There's a shared sense of belonging. And it seems to me that answers a certain, like, fundamental loneliness that may be part of the American experience in the 21st century. Not to get too theoretical about it, but I think that probably dovetails with some of the, you know, sort of religious inclinations here.
No, Alex, listen, you're hitting the nail right on the head. When you think about the shared identity, the common, you know, you described it as a sense of belonging, and I think that that's right. And when you think about, you know, why people gather in a religious setting, it is because they are part of one body, and as a part of that body, they are sort of transcending the world around them, and they are coming together to worship a God that is bigger than them. And in the evangelical tradition, in the Christian tradition, you know, that is to worship Jesus and to draw closer to Jesus and to become more and more Christ-like. That is the essence of that particular religious experience. And it is, you know, it's not an exaggeration when you go to these Trump rallies to talk with folks like the one that you just quoted from that article, and they are describing it in eerily similar terms, that it is a sort of transcendent religious experience that is rooted in notions of shared identity, and they are very much coming there to pursue a sort of salvation. It may not be a biblical salvation, but it is a salvation that's rooted in this same sense of you know, something that they can't find anywhere else, and they're coming back for it time and time again. And just, I would note quickly, Alex, if during Barack Obama's presidency, or while he was running for president, if you had heard him talking with or promoting a video saying that he was a shepherd to all of mankind, the evangelical movement would have been up in arms. I mean, this is heretical. This is blasphemous. And yet, Donald Trump seems to get a pass time and time again for doing these things that no other politician, Republican or Democrat, frankly, would get a pass for doing. And we should ask ourselves why. If the answer does not at least start to flirt with this terrain of civil religion or political religion, then I think that we're not being honest with ourselves. And if we are being honest with ourselves, if we are willing to engage with the very uncomfortable topic around what happens when Trumpism becomes civil religion in this country for millions and millions of people, and what that might imply moving forward, then we are doing a disservice to our pluralistic democracy.
Tim, I really think you're one of the most well-informed thinkers and writers on this topic. I'm deeply appreciative of your time and your writing. Thanks again.
Thanks, Alex.